Hey everyone, I'm here to help you relax and drift off tonight. If you enjoy using these videos to fall asleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more calming content. Share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know. Now settle into a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's start unwinding together. In the remote village of Gravemore, nestled deep within the heart of a dark forest, there was an ancient legend whispered by the elders, the tale of the death owl. It was said that if you saw the owl perched in a tree or heard its haunting hoot, your days were numbered. No one knew exactly how the owl chose its victims, but every story ended the same way. The person who saw the owl would die within 7 days. At first, the villagers dismissed the tale as an old superstition meant to keep children from wandering into the woods at night. But over time, strange occurrences made even the most skeptical villagers believe. People who claimed to have seen the owl always met mysterious, often violent, deaths. One autumn evening, as the wind howled through the trees and leaves fell like golden rain, a stranger arrived in Gravemore. His name was Elias Greaves, a traveling scholar fascinated by folklore and ancient curses. He had heard of the death owl during his travels and was determined to uncover the truth behind the legend. Elias checked into the village inn, a creaky old building with wooden beams and flickering lanterns. As he sat by the fire, he struck up a conversation with Martha, the innkeeper. "You're not from around here, are you?" Martha asked, eyeing him with suspicion. "No, I'm here to learn about the death owl," Elias said, leaning forward. "I've studied similar legends in other regions, but this one intrigues me. Have you ever seen it?" Martha shuddered and crossed herself. "No, thank the spirits. But my uncle did. He saw it perched outside his window one night, staring at him with those glowing eyes. 7 days later, he was found dead in the woods, not a mark on him, but frozen in fear." "Do you know where he saw it?" Elias asked, his curiosity piqued. "In the old part of the forest, near the abandoned chapel," Martha said. "But I wouldn't go there if I were you. The owl doesn't like to be followed." Despite the warnings, Elias ventured into the woods the next morning. The air was crisp, and the forest was eerily quiet, save for the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. As he walked deeper into the woods, he noticed how the light seemed to dim, even though the sun was high in the sky. He reached the abandoned chapel Martha had mentioned. It was little more than a crumbling ruin, overgrown with ivy and moss. As he explored the area, a sudden chill ran down his spine. He turned around and saw it, the death owl. Perched on a low-hanging branch, the owl was larger than any he had ever seen. Its feathers were dark, almost blending with the shadows, and its eyes glowed a fierce amber. It stared at Elias unblinking, as if peering into his very soul. Elias felt an overwhelming sense of dread, but he forced himself to remain calm. He took out his notebook and sketched the owl, determined to document every detail. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the owl spread its wings and flew off into the forest, its haunting hoot echoing through the trees. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the owl's glowing eyes. He tried to convince himself that it was just an ordinary owl and that the villagers' fear was born of superstition. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. The next morning, he woke to find a strange mark on his wrist, a faint outline of an owl, as if it had been branded into his skin. Panic set in. He had heard stories of people being marked after seeing the death owl, and none of those stories ended well. Determined to break the curse, Elias sought out the village elder, old Magnus, who was said to know the old ways. Magnus lived on the edge of the village, in a hut filled with herbs and ancient relics. "You saw it, didn't you?" Magnus said the moment Elias entered. "Yes," Elias admitted, "and now I've been marked. How do I stop this?" Magnus sighed heavily. "The death owl serves an ancient spirit of the forest, one that watches over the balance of life and death. If it marked you, it means your fate is sealed, but there may be a way to appease the spirit." "What must I do?" Elias asked eagerly. "You must return to the forest and find the Tree of Souls," Magnus said. "It is the heart of the forest where the spirit resides. Offer something of great value, something tied to your life. If the spirit accepts your offering, the mark will fade." Elias wasted no time. Armed with a lantern and a satchel of personal items, he set off into the woods once more. The deeper he went, the darker and colder it became. Strange whispers filled the air, as if the forest itself was alive and watching him. After hours of searching, he finally found it, the Tree of Souls. It was an ancient gnarled oak, its bark glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. The air around it was thick with an unearthly energy. Elias knelt before the tree and took out a locket containing a picture of his late mother, the only item he had that held deep personal meaning. He placed the locket at the base of the tree and whispered a prayer. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground trembled, and a soft light enveloped the locket. The mark on Elias's wrist began to glow, then slowly faded away. The curse was lifted. Elias returned to the village, weary but relieved. He shared his story with the villagers, who listened in awe. From that day forward, the legend of the death owl changed. No longer was it seen as a harbinger of inevitable doom, but as a messenger of the forest spirit, one that could be appeased by those brave enough to face it. Elias eventually left Gravemore, continuing his travels and sharing the story of the death owl wherever he went. But in the quiet village, the owl's haunting hoot could still be heard on dark nights, reminding everyone that some legends, no matter how they end, are never truly forgotten. And for those who saw the owl, one question always lingered. Was it a warning or an invitation to face their fate? In the quiet village of Arendelle, nestled between rolling hills and ancient forests, there existed an age-old belief passed down through generations, a special dream that came once in a person's lifetime, allowing them to meet the spirits of their ancestors. They called it the ancestral dream, and it was considered both a blessing and a burden. The villagers believed that those who had the dream were chosen to learn sacred truths about their lineage and destiny, but also that they must bear the weight of whatever secrets were revealed. One chilly autumn night, Mira, a young woman of 22, awoke suddenly, her heart racing as though she had just run miles. Her room was bathed in the soft glow of the full moon, and the air felt different, thicker, charged with a strange energy. As she tried to calm herself, a whisper echoed in her mind. "Come to us, Mira. It is time." Mira's grandmother, Alicia, had often spoken of the ancestral dream before she passed away. "When it comes," Alicia had said, "you will know. The dream will be unlike any other, for it will not be a dream at all, but a journey beyond the veil." That night, as Mira drifted back to sleep, the world around her changed. The walls of her room melted away, replaced by a vast, misty plain, stretching endlessly in all directions. The air smelled of earth and rain, and a soft light glowed in the distance. As Mira walked through the mist, she felt neither fear nor cold, only a deep sense of curiosity. Before long, shadowy figures began to materialize around her. At first, they were faint, like wisps of smoke, but as she drew closer, they became clearer. Men, women, and children dressed in garments from different eras, each face filled with a calm, otherworldly wisdom. One figure stepped forward. It was Alicia, her features glowing with a gentle light. "Welcome, Mira," she said, her voice as warm and familiar as it had been in life. "You have been called here to learn who you are and who you will become." Mira's eyes filled with tears. "Grandmother, is it really you?" Alicia smiled. "Yes, child, but I am not alone. You stand among generations of our family, those who came before you and those who will come after. We are all bound by the same thread, woven into the great tapestry of life." Elijah led Mira to a circle where other spirits had gathered. As they sat together one by one, the spirits shared stories of their lives. Mira learned of her great-great-grandfather, Torin, who had been a wandering bard, of her ancestor, Lyra, who had fled persecution and found refuge in Arendelle, and of Rhiannon, a healer who had saved the village from a terrible plague long ago. Each story revealed not only the hardships her ancestors had faced, but also their resilience, courage, and love. Mira realized that she carried their strength within her, that their struggles and triumphs were a part of her own identity. But not all stories were filled with light. One spirit, a stern-looking man named Alaric, told of a dark secret, the betrayal of a close friend that had led to a feud lasting generations. "It is time to end this cycle of mistrust," Alaric said. "You have the power to heal the wounds of the past." As the stories came to an end, Elisha spoke again. You now know where you come from, but your journey is not over. You have a role to play in shaping the future of our family. There is a storm coming to Arendelle, one that will test the strength of the village. You must stand as a beacon of hope and unity. Mira felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of storm? That we cannot say, Elisha replied. But remember this, the bond of family is stronger than any force. Trust in your roots, and you will find the strength to face whatever comes. When Mira awoke, it was dawn. The dream lingered vividly in her mind, every detail etched into her memory. She felt different, stronger, more connected to something greater than herself. She knew that the ancestral dream had not been a mere vision, but a real experience in a realm beyond time and space. Over the following weeks, Mira shared what she had learned with her family and the villagers. Her words inspired a renewed sense of unity in Arendelle, as people remembered the sacrifices and wisdom of those who had come before them. They prepared for the coming storm, whatever it might be, with a newfound strength born of their shared heritage. And when the storm finally came, a fierce blizzard that threatened to cut off the village from the outside world, it was Mira who led the efforts to keep everyone safe, drawing on the courage of her ancestors to guide her. Together, the villagers weathered the storm, emerging stronger and more united than ever. Years later, Mira would become the village elder, known for her wisdom and compassion. She often spoke of the ancestral dream, encouraging others to listen for the call when their time came. For in Arendelle, it was now known that the dream was not just a gift, it was a reminder that no one ever truly stands alone. Each person is a link in a chain stretching back through time, connected by love, memory, and the enduring strength of family. And so, the legend of the ancestral dream lived on, ensuring that the spirits of the past would always be there to guide the living, offering wisdom, hope, and the promise that even in the darkest times, they would never walk alone. It began with a single dream, vague and fleeting. Ethan Hayes, a 28-year-old architect, had always been a practical man, not prone to imagination or whimsy. But after the first dream, he woke drenched in sweat, his heart racing as though he had just sprinted a mile. He remembered fragments, a narrow path winding through a dense forest, the air heavy with mist, and an old decrepit mansion standing in the middle of nowhere. At first, Ethan dismissed it as a random nightmare. After all, he'd been under a lot of stress with an upcoming project. Yet the dream returned the next night, and the night after that. Each time, it grew more vivid, more real. He could feel the chill in the air, smell the damp earth beneath his feet, and hear the distant creaking of the mansion's rotting timbers. The most unsettling part was how familiar it all felt, as though he had been there before. By the end of the week, Ethan could no longer ignore the pull of the dream. The mansion was more than just a figment of his imagination. It felt tangible, as though it truly existed somewhere out in the world. He began sketching what he saw, each detail of the mansion's Gothic facade, the broken windows, the towering spires, and the dense forest surrounding it. When he showed the sketches to his best friend, Mia, she frowned. "This looks familiar," she said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "There's an old legend about a haunted estate deep in the woods outside of town. People say it's cursed. No one who goes looking for it ever comes back." Ethan laughed nervously. "Come on, Mia. You don't really believe in that stuff, do you?" "I don't," Mia admitted. "But these sketches, they match the description perfectly. Maybe you should leave it alone." But Ethan couldn't. The dream wasn't just a dream anymore. It was a calling. Determined to find the truth, Ethan gathered supplies and persuaded Mia to accompany him. "If this is real, I need someone I trust with me," he explained. Though reluctant, Mia agreed, knowing Ethan wouldn't give up until he found the place haunting his dreams. The next morning, they set off toward the forest on the edge of town. The deeper they went, the more the scenery mirrored Ethan's dream. The path twisted and turned, the trees growing denser, their gnarled branches forming a canopy overhead. The air grew colder, and an unnatural silence settled around them, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. Hours passed, and just as Mia was about to suggest turning back, they saw it, the mansion from Ethan's dream. It stood exactly as he had sketched it, ancient and decaying, with ivy crawling up its stone walls and shattered windows, staring like hollow eyes. Mia shivered. I can't believe it's real. Despite every instinct telling them to leave, Ethan approached the mansion's front door, which hung loosely on rusted hinges. Pushing it open, they stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards groaned beneath their weight. Shadows danced on the walls as light filtered through cracks in the ceiling. Exploring the mansion felt surreal. Every room was eerily familiar to Ethan, as though he had walked these halls countless times before. In one room, they found an old grand piano covered in cobwebs. In another, a library filled with decaying books. But it was in the main hall that they discovered something truly chilling, a large ornate mirror standing against the far wall. Ethan felt drawn to the mirror, though he didn't know why. As he approached it, the air grew colder, and a strange hum filled the room. Suddenly, the mirror's surface rippled, and a ghostly figure appeared. A woman in a tattered dress, her eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. "Help us," she whispered. "Set us free." Terrified, Mia grabbed Ethan's arm. "We need to get out of here." But Ethan didn't move. He stared at the figure, his mind racing. "Who are you?" he asked. "We are those trapped by the curse," the woman said. "This place exists between worlds, a prison for lost souls. You have the power to break the curse, but only if you're willing to face what lies within." Before Ethan could respond, the mansion trembled and shadows began to pour from the walls, taking on monstrous forms. Mia screamed and they both turned to run, but the front door slammed shut, trapping them inside. "We have to find a way out," Mia shouted. "No," Ethan said, a strange calm settling over him. "We have to face it. That's what the dream has been leading me to." Gathering his courage, Ethan turned back toward the mirror. The ghostly woman's image flickered, and the shadows closed in around them. "What do I have to do?" he asked. "Confront your fear," the woman replied. "Only then can the curse be lifted." Ethan closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He thought of everything that had ever haunted him. His fear of failure, the guilt he carried over things he couldn't change, and the anxiety that had plagued him for years. As he confronted these feelings, the shadows began to recede, their forms dissolving into mist. When he opened his eyes, the mansion was still. The ghostly woman smiled faintly. "You have done what many could not. The curse is broken." The next thing Ethan knew, he and Mia were standing outside the mansion. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the forest. The mansion itself was gone, as though it had never been there. "Did that really happen?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. Ethan nodded. "It did, and I think we set them free." They returned to town, forever changed by the experience. Though no one believed their story, Ethan knew the truth. The recurring dream never came back, but he would always remember the haunted mansion and the souls they had saved. In time, Ethan found peace, knowing that he had answered the call of the dream and faced the darkness within himself. And though the mansion was gone, its memory lingered, a reminder that sometimes the greatest hauntings are those that lie within. There's a small town nestled in the shadow of a mountain range, cut off from the world by dense forests and winding roads. Life in Wilmount was quiet, peaceful even, until the whispers began. Whispers of a nightmare, one that didn't just haunt dreams, but crept into the waking world, growing stronger every time it was spoken aloud. It started with a young boy named Evan, who woke screaming one night, his face pale and drenched in sweat. His parents rushed to his room, trying to comfort him, but he was inconsolable. Between sobs, he described the nightmare in vivid detail, a dark figure with hollow eyes, its form shifting like smoke, always just out of reach. "It watches from the corners," he whispered. "It knows when you speak of it." His parents chalked it up to an overactive imagination, perhaps fueled by ghost stories the kids at school were sharing. But Evan's terror was contagious. The next day, he told his friends about the nightmare, his voice trembling as he recounted every chilling detail. That night, 4 more children in town woke up screaming, claiming to have seen the same dark figure. By the end of the week, over a dozen people had reported having the same nightmare. Some were adults, others children, but the description was always identical: a shadowy figure lurking in the periphery, never fully visible, but unmistakably malevolent. Worse still, those who shared the nightmare aloud claimed that the figure began to appear in their waking lives. A flicker of darkness in a mirror, a whisper in an empty room, a fleeting shadow at the edge of their vision. Fear spread through the town like wildfire. People stopped talking about their dreams, terrified that speaking of the nightmare would make it real. The local school shut down after half the students refused to leave their homes, too scared to sleep at night. Even the town's pastor, Father Donovan, admitted during a sermon that he'd had the nightmare. "This is not ordinary fear," he said gravely. "It is something darker, something unnatural." Amid the growing panic, a young journalist named Claire Reynolds arrived in Wilmot. She had heard about the strange events and wanted to investigate. Claire wasn't one to believe in the supernatural, but the sheer number of reports intrigued her. Mass hysteria, she told herself. There's always a logical explanation. Claire began interviewing residents, but she quickly noticed something unusual. Whenever someone started to describe the nightmare, they would grow visibly anxious, their eyes darting nervously around the room, as if expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. One elderly woman, Mrs. Holloway, refused to speak at all, her hands trembling as she pointed to a sign on her wall that read, "Do not speak of the shadow." Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Claire stayed at the local inn, where she planned to spend the night. She had heard about the nightmare so many times that she half expected to dream about it herself, and that's exactly what happened. In her dream, she stood in a dark, empty room. The air was thick with a cold, suffocating presence. From the shadows, a figure emerged, its form hazy and ever-shifting, its eyes two hollow voids. It didn't speak, but Claire felt its intent. It was waiting for something, feeding on fear. She woke with a start, heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, she sat frozen in bed, the nightmare still clinging to her mind like a dark fog. She reached for her notebook, intending to write down what she had seen, but her hand trembled too much to hold the pen. "It's just a dream," she whispered to herself. "It can't hurt me." But deep down, she wasn't so sure. The next morning, Claire met with Father Donovan, hoping to find answers. "Have you ever seen anything like this before?" she asked. The priest hesitated before answering. "There's an old legend," he said slowly, "about a curse tied to words. In ancient times, there were stories of nightmares that could be summoned into the real world if spoken of too often. Words have power, Claire, and fear gives that power strength. You're saying this thing becomes real because people talk about it?" "Not just talk about it," Donovan said gravely. "It feeds on belief. The more people fear it, the stronger it becomes." Claire considered this. If the nightmare fed on fear, then perhaps the only way to stop it was to break the cycle, to convince people that it wasn't real. Claire decided to take a bold approach. She called a town meeting and urged everyone to attend. Reluctantly, the townsfolk gathered in the church, their faces pale and tense. The air was thick with unease, as though the shadow itself were lurking among them. "I know you're all scared," Claire began, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I've had the nightmare too. I saw the figure, felt its presence, but I refuse to let it control me. This thing, whatever it is, only has power if we give it power. If we stop fearing it, if we stop believing in it, it will lose its grip on us." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked skeptical. One man stood up. "And what if you're wrong? What if talking about it makes it stronger?" Claire took a deep breath. "I don't know for sure, but I do know that living in fear will destroy us faster than any nightmare ever could." That night, something changed. Though many were still afraid, they tried to push the fear aside, refusing to speak of the nightmare. Over the next few days, fewer people reported having the dream. The dark figures stopped appearing in mirrors and shadows. Gradually, life in Wilmot returned to normal. Claire stayed for a while longer, documenting the strange events in the town's recovery. Though she never saw the nightmare again, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, lurking in the corners of the mind, waiting for someone to give it power once more. She published her story under the title, "The Nightmare That Lived," warning readers of the dangers of fear and belief. Whether the nightmare was truly gone or simply lying dormant, no one could say for sure. But one thing was certain. In the quiet town of Wilmot, people had learned that sometimes The scariest monsters are the ones we create ourselves. And sometimes the only way to defeat them is to stop believing in their power. Years later, Claire received a letter from an unknown sender. It contained only one line: "The nightmare never truly dies." Claire stared at the words, her heart pounding. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she felt the cold presence of the shadow once more. She didn't speak of it. In the quiet town of Eldermore, nestled between a dense forest and a misty lake, something strange had begun to happen. People whispered of dreams that felt too real. Dreams where the air was cold, the world was colorless, and shadowy figures moved just out of sight. At first, it seemed like nothing more than an odd coincidence. But soon, those who experienced the dreams began to notice something unsettling. Every time they awoke, they returned with a sense of dread, as if part of them had never truly left that ghostly world. It started with Lena, a local baker. One night after an exhausting day at work, she fell into a deep sleep. In her dream, she found herself standing in the middle of an empty street, shrouded in thick fog. The buildings around her looked familiar, but they were decayed, as if abandoned for decades. A cold wind whispered through the air, carrying faint, mournful voices. "Is anyone there?" Lena called out, her voice echoing unnaturally in the stillness. She took a hesitant step forward, her feet crunching on brittle leaves that covered the ground. Shadows flickered at the edge of her vision, and though she saw no one, she felt an oppressive presence watching her. Suddenly, the wind stopped, and the air grew deathly silent. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a figure, a pale, ghostly form standing motionless at the end of the street. Before she could react, the figure raised a hand and pointed directly at her. Lena woke up gasping for breath, her heart pounding in her chest. At first, she tried to dismiss the dream as nothing more than a product of stress and fatigue, but the next night the dream returned, exactly the same, only this time, the figure was closer. Within a week, more people in Eldermore began reporting similar dreams. Each described the same ghostly world, a colorless landscape cloaked in mist, familiar yet decayed, with shadowy figures lurking just out of reach. Some claimed they heard whispers calling their names. Others spoke of strange symbols carved into the walls of the dream world's buildings, symbols they couldn't understand, but felt were somehow important. What made the dreams even more disturbing was the fact that they were shared. People who dreamed of the ghostly world could recount details that others had seen, as if they were all being drawn into the same place, a realm beyond sleep. Fear spread quickly. Some residents refused to sleep, terrified of being transported to the ghostly world. The local doctor, Dr. Harris, tried to calm the growing panic by prescribing sleeping aids and counseling, but nothing seemed to help. Those who dared to sleep returned more shaken than before, and some began to show signs of exhaustion and paranoia. Desperate for answers, the town's mayor, Arthur Grayson, sought help from an old acquaintance, Professor Eleanora Blackwell, a historian and expert in local folklore. Eleanora arrived a few days later, armed with ancient texts and a determination to uncover the truth. After interviewing several of the afflicted townsfolk and examining their descriptions of the dream world, she came to a startling conclusion. "I believe you're experiencing what old legends refer to as the Veiled Realm," she explained during a town meeting. "It's said to be a place where the souls of the restless dwell, a world caught between life and death. According to the texts, those who are drawn into it are being summoned by something or someone." The townspeople listened in stunned silence. "Summoned for what?" someone finally asked. Eleanor hesitated before answering. "Perhaps to join the realm permanently." As more people succumbed to the dream, something even more terrifying began to happen. Those who experienced the dreams for too many nights in a row started to fade. Literally, their skin grew pale, their voices faint, and they complained of feeling cold even in the warmest rooms. Dr. Harris was baffled. Medically, they seemed fine, but it was as if their connection to the physical world was weakening. One night, Lena, who had been among the first to experience the dreams, failed to wake up. Her husband found her lying in bed, her body cold and lifeless, yet without any sign of illness or injury. The town was thrown into a state of panic. People feared that if they continued dreaming of the ghostly world, they too would eventually be trapped there forever. Eleonora proposed a daring plan. If this realm is a place between life and death, then there must be a way to sever the connection before it becomes permanent. I believe we can confront whatever is summoning you. How? Asked Arthur, his voice tense. There's a ritual in these ancient texts, an old method meant to anchor one's spirit firmly in the living world. But it requires someone to willingly enter the veiled realm and find the source of the summoning. I'll do it, Lena's brother Marcus volunteered. I've been having the dreams too, and I can't let this thing take anyone else. Despite protests, Marcus insisted. That night, under Eleanor's guidance, he lay down in the town hall, surrounded by symbols meant to protect his spirit. The townspeople waited anxiously as he drifted off to sleep, hoping he would succeed. In the veiled realm, Marcus found himself in the same ghostly town he had seen before. Only now the air felt heavier, colder. He moved cautiously through the fog, calling out Lena's name, but there was no response. After what felt like hours, he reached the town's old clock tower, where he saw the figure, the one everyone had described in their dreams. It was no longer distant. The figure was close now, its features clearer, a woman with hollow eyes and a sorrowful expression. As Marcus approached, she raised a hand, and the whispers grew louder. "Who are you?" Marcus demanded. "Why are you doing this?" The woman didn't answer. Instead, she pointed toward the ground, where Marcus saw a symbol, the same one Eleanor had described from her text. Realizing it was the source of the summoning, he reached out and placed his hand over it, concentrating on the living world. Back in the town hall, Eleanor chanted the final words of the ritual. Marcus's body trembled, and for a moment it seemed as if he might fade away completely. But then, with a sudden gasp, he awoke. The connection to the veiled realm had been severed. Over the following days, the dream stopped. Those who had begun to fade slowly regained their strength, and the town of Eldermore returned to normal. Though they were safe, the experience left a lasting mark on everyone involved. Years later, Marcus would sometimes dream of the ghostly world, but now it was empty, peaceful. The restless souls had found their peace, and the veiled realm was no longer a place of fear. Yet every so often, when the mist rolled in from the lake, he couldn't help but wonder if the realm was truly gone, or if it was simply waiting for another summoning. The small town of Greyford had always been a quiet, unassuming place. Nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, it was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and life followed a peaceful, predictable rhythm. That was, until one cold winter evening, when something strange began to happen. An event that would change the lives of Greyford's residents forever. It started with a handful of people. On an otherwise ordinary night, several townsfolk were found wandering the streets in their nightclothes, barefoot and shivering in the snow. Their eyes were open, but they were unseeing, their expressions blank and devoid of emotion. When concerned neighbors tried to wake them, they wouldn't respond. They simply continued walking, as if drawn by an invisible force. By morning, those who had been sleepwalking woke up in strange places, parks, alleyways, even in the middle of the forest, confused and frightened. None of them remembered how they got there, nor did they recall anything unusual about the previous night. The town dismissed it as a bizarre coincidence, perhaps a result of collective stress or some environmental factor. But that explanation didn't hold for long. Over the following week, the sleepwalking incidents increased. More and more people were found wandering aimlessly at night, and no one seemed immune. Children, adults, and the elderly alike were affected. Entire families were discovered walking together in eerie silence, their footsteps crunching through the frost-covered streets. Attempts to wake the sleepwalkers proved futile. Shaking them, shouting, even splashing cold water on them had no effect. Doctors in the town were baffled. There was no apparent medical cause for the sudden epidemic, and none of the usual treatments for sleep disorders worked. "I've never seen anything like this," admitted Dr. Amelia Carter, the town's physician. "It's as if something, or someone, is controlling them." One night, Jonas Thatcher, a local farmer, was keeping watch over his sleepwalking wife. He had barricaded the bedroom door, determined not to let her wander off again. Around midnight, as he struggled to stay awake, he heard something strange outside. Whispers carried by the wind. They were faint but unmistakable, as if a crowd of unseen people were murmuring just beyond the walls of his home. Jonas crept to the window and peered outside. To his horror, he saw several of his neighbors standing motionless in the middle of the street, all staring in the same direction, toward the forest. Moments later, his wife began to stir. Despite the barricade, she rose from the bed and tried to leave the room, her eyes glassy and her expression vacant. Panicking, Jonas grabbed her shoulders and shook her violently. "Wake up, Martha," he cried, but she didn't react. Instead, she began to whisper, her voice blending with the wind outside. Come to the forest." The next morning, word spread that dozens of townspeople had disappeared during the night. Their footprints led toward the dense forest on the outskirts of town, but none of them had returned. A search party was quickly organized, led by Sheriff Tom Grayson. Armed with flashlights and rifles, the group ventured into the forest, hoping to find their missing friends and loved ones. As they moved deeper into the woods, an unnatural silence fell over them. The usual sounds of wildlife were absent, replaced by an oppressive stillness that made the hairs on their necks stand on end. Then they began to hear it, the whispering wind. At first it was barely audible, but as they pressed on, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The words were unclear, but the tone was unmistakably beckoning, luring them further into the forest. In a clearing deep within the woods, the search party found the missing townsfolk standing in a perfect circle around an ancient, gnarled tree. Their eyes remained vacant, and they swayed slightly, as if entranced by an unseen force. Sheriff Grayson approached cautiously, calling out to them, but they didn't respond. Suddenly, the air grew cold, and a chilling figure emerged from the shadows. It was a translucent, spectral woman, her long hair flowing as if caught in an invisible breeze. Her eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and her lips moved in sync with the whispering wind. "Who are you?" Grayson demanded, raising his rifle. The spirit's voice echoed unnaturally, filling the clearing. "I am Ismara, the forgotten, the betrayed. Long ago they cast me out, left me to die in this forest. Now I call them back to me, to join me in the shadows." Eleanora Blackwell, a local historian who had joined the search party, stepped forward. "Esmara, I've read about you. You were accused of witchcraft centuries ago, weren't you? They banished you to the forest, thinking you were cursed." The spirit's expression darkened. "They feared what they did not understand. They took my life, but they could not take my soul. Now, I will take theirs." Realizing that Ismara was the source of the sleepwalking epidemic, Eleanora knew they had to act quickly. "There's an old ritual," she whispered to Grayson. "If we can perform it, we might be able to release her spirit and end this." With Esmara's attention focused on the entranced townsfolk, Eleanora began to draw a circle of salt around the tree. She chanted the ancient words from memory, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her heart. Esmara let out a furious wail as she realized what was happening. The wind howled, and the forest seemed to come alive, branches whipping toward the search party. But Eleanora didn't stop. She completed the ritual just as Esmara lunged toward her. There was a blinding flash of light, and when it faded, the spirit was gone. The whispering wind fell silent, and the entranced townsfolk collapsed to the ground, unconscious but unharmed. In the days that followed, Grayford slowly returned to normal. Those who had been affected by the sleepwalking epidemic recovered, though none of them remembered their time in the forest. The ancient tree was cut down and burned, and Eleanora ensured that the ritual was recorded, should anything like this ever happen again. Though the town tried to move on, the events of that winter night left a lasting mark. Grayford had faced the darkness and survived, but the whispers of the forest would never be forgotten. And every so often, when the wind blew just right, some claimed they could still hear Esmara's voice, calling out from beyond the veil of the living world. The first case was recorded in a remote village at the edge of the mountain range. A young woman named Alina was found standing in her home, motionless, her eyes wide with terror. Her skin had taken on a translucent sheen, and although she was clearly breathing, her form seemed to flicker, as though struggling to remain anchored to the physical world. Her voice, when she tried to speak, was faint and echoing, like a distant whisper carried by the wind. The villagers gathered around her, horrified by the sight. By the next morning, she was gone, vanished without a trace. News of Alina's fate spread quickly, but most dismissed it as a wild tale or hallucination. brought on by isolation and superstition. However, within weeks, more cases began to emerge in nearby towns. Victims initially experienced dizziness and fatigue, followed by a gradual fading of their physical forms. Their bodies became semi-transparent, and they struggled to interact with the world around them. Doors would slip through their grasp, their footsteps made no sound, and their voices became echoes of themselves. Worst of all, within days, each victim vanished entirely, as if pulled into another plane of existence. The disease didn't discriminate. Men, women, children, all were susceptible. Panic gripped the region as more and more people began to exhibit the symptoms. Those who vanished were mourned like the dead, though no bodies were left behind to bury. Desperate for answers, the regional government dispatched a team of scientists led by Dr. Elias Klein, a renowned virologist. Klein and his team set up a research station in the heart of the afflicted area. They interviewed witnesses, examined the homes of the vanished, and tested the blood of those showing early symptoms. "This isn't like anything we've ever seen before," Klein admitted in a recorded report. "It's as though the victims are phasing out of reality. We're dealing with something that defies all known biological laws." Despite their efforts, the scientists made little progress. The disease continued to spread, affecting entire towns. It wasn't contagious in the conventional sense. Proximity to an infected individual didn't guarantee transmission. Instead, it seemed almost selective. Those afflicted had no common link, no shared food source, no environmental exposure, no genetic similarity. As the weeks turned into months, fear gave way to despair. The disease earned a name whispered in terrified tones: the Phantom Plague. In the absence of concrete answers, theories and rumors flourished. Some believed the disease was the result of an ancient curse, punishment for disturbing sacred grounds in the mountains. Others speculated that it was caused by a strange energy emanating from deep within the earth, a force awakening after centuries of dormancy. One particularly chilling rumor suggested that the victims weren't truly vanishing, but rather being pulled into a parallel world where they existed as ghosts. Survivors claimed to have seen loved ones standing at the edge of their vision, only to disappear when approached. "I swear I saw my brother last night," said one man in a trembling voice. "He's been gone for weeks, but he was there, standing by the window. When I called his name, he faded away." Everything changed when Mara, a scientist in Klein's team, began to show early symptoms. Knowing she had limited time, Mara insisted on being monitored around the clock. "If I'm going to vanish," she said, "I want someone to witness it." As her condition worsened, she recorded her experiences. "It feels like I'm slipping away, like I don't fully belong here anymore. I can hear things, whispers, faint and distant, calling to me." On the fourth day of her symptoms, Mara's body began to flicker more violently. She could no longer hold objects. Her hands passed through them like mist. She smiled weakly at Klein. "I think I understand now. It's not a disease. It's a transformation." Before anyone could respond, Mara vanished. But unlike the others, she left behind something. A faint, glowing outline of her form, hovering in the air like a ghostly afterimage. It faded within moments, but it was enough to convince Klein that the victims weren't gone. They were somewhere else. Determined to find answers, Klein and his team began to experiment with frequencies and electromagnetic fields, theorizing that the victims were being pulled into another dimension. Using sophisticated equipment, they attempted to recreate the conditions of the transformation. One night, while conducting an experiment, they detected a strange signal, faint and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. The signal grew stronger as they adjusted their instruments, and then, for a brief moment, they saw them. Dozens of ghostly figures standing in the room, watching silently. Among them was Mara. "Mara!" Klein shouted. "Can you hear us?" Mara didn't respond, but she raised a hand in a gesture of farewell before fading away again. The team was shaken, but also exhilarated. They now knew the victims weren't dead. They were trapped in a liminal space between worlds. With time running out and the disease continuing to spread, Klein devised a risky plan. Using a powerful electromagnetic pulse, he hoped to open a temporary gateway between the two dimensions, allowing the victims to return. It was a dangerous gamble. If it failed, it could accelerate the transformation of everyone in the region. On the night of the experiment, the town gathered anxiously around the research station. Klein activated the device, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then the air shimmered, and the ghostly forms of the vanished began to appear, more solid than before. "It's working!" someone cried. One by one, the victims returned, collapsing to the ground, weak but alive. Mara was the last to emerge, smiling as Klein helped her to her feet. "You did it," she whispered. "You brought us back." In the weeks that followed, the spread of the phantom plague ceased. The survivors were closely monitored, but none showed any lasting effects. The government declared the crisis over, though Klein knew they had only scratched the surface of a greater mystery. To this day, no one knows exactly what caused the disease or where the victims had gone. Some believe it was a rift between dimensions, a rare cosmic anomaly. Others think it was something beyond human comprehension, a brush with the unknown. Though the town returned to normal, whispers of the phantom plague persisted, and every so often, when the air grew cold and the night was still, some claimed they could see faint, ghostly figures standing at the edge of the forest, watching silently before fading back into the shadows.